Welcome to Exhibition. And hello, Joe Bertini.
Hi, Richard. So good to see you again.
It is great to see you again too. And your exhibition is Songs of Dry Hills at Art House Gallery in Sydney. And those dry hills are far away. Where has home been for you for some time now? And where are these group of works derived from?
So for the last 5 years, I've been in New Mexico in a place called, I live in a place called Abiquiu, which is in northern New Mexico, and it's right out in the desert. And the dry hills are the dry hills that I reference in the exhibition, are the dry hills that surround my studio, which is a little self-contained adobe studio. Adobe is like a type of mud brick, or it is a mud brick studio that I have perched on top of the hill on our property, which is in Abiquiu. So, and I've been going back and forth to New Mexico, like I said, for the last 5 years, and now, well, last year I was there all year permanently.
As a body of work, these paintings are just rich with colour. They vibrate with colour. So let's go straight to that question of colour in your work and your colour choices. What would you describe as the kind of the principles of the way in which you incorporate colour into your work?
I don't know. It's my language. Colour's always been my language. It's second nature. And I don't really feel like I'm consciously working with colour. It's just how my paintings have evolved, and colour's just become a big element. I think I've just always worked with very vibrant colour. I've always been comfortable with it. And, you know, spending decades out in the centre of Australia, and, you know, deserts all over the world, like even India, all the work I did in India, and now New Mexico. New Mexico has these incredible striations. The place where I am in Abiquiu it's traditionally known as, they call it O'Keeffe country, although the Anasazi and the Native American Indians would be quite horrified that Westerners call it that. But it has that classic kind of rich red ochres and yellows, and then the white clays and black basalt and sand, like just these multicolored sands. And I see it. I just see the color in the landscape.
When we look, for example, at an incredibly pink sky, can you recall the decision or the feeling when you decide to make a sky such an extraordinary color?
I'm wedged in this valley, in the Rio Grande Valley, between these two massive mountain ranges. And they're very high mountain ranges because they're new relative to Australia. So they attract weather, and they attract these incredible cloud formations, incredible sunset, sunrises. I mean, I'm constantly running outside with my gouache and my paints because everything's gone gold or everything's gone pink, and it's fast, it's very ephemeral and fleeting, but it's there, and I see it. It plays out all around me.
Moving from colour into perhaps some of the sense of detail in your work. These works seem in some ways more intensely detailed in their observation of the landscape, perhaps, than I've seen in past years. Has that been a product of spending so much time compulsorily in the landscape and in isolation?
Yeah, it's definitely, I definitely feel that there's been a shift because of that privilege of having a whole year to be so isolated and to have nothing to do other than paint and, you know, shop for groceries, but basically to just have the privilege of every single day out in the landscape working or in the studio working, and no distraction. So I had to learn all the flora and fauna, and I've had to learn to recognize the differences in the desert. And I think that just means the looking and the understanding, the knowledge base has just grown a lot deeper. So the paintings have more substance, maybe, hopefully.
You mentioned that sense of being familiar with the landscape, and I wonder if maybe you can take us to one or two of the places that are um, in specific works, if we can go to one or two of them. Hidden River of Sand.
The river of sand is a reference, it's a metaphor for me for mythologies. So it's not just a literal interpretation of the river of sand running underneath the desert, but a river of time. So there's a great geological sense of time in deserts, which I think the human nature is to instinctively respond to that. But there's also great sense of the nomadic cultures and the indigenous cultures that traverse the landscape. So the River of Sands is not just geological, but it's also temporal. So it's also about time, but it's also about the human nature of traversing deserts and nomadism.
Many people also tend to think of deserts as not being very rich with life. And yet your landscapes are intensely rich with life. A work like Seeding a Tumbled Canyon both has vegetation, but it's also that potential for all of that new growth.
Indigenous people and nomadic people traditionally always had deserts as places of reflection and contemplation and benevolence. They were homelands. They weren't wastelands, they were homelands. And so I'm fascinated by the dichotomy. And then there's this contemporary concept of deserts as being, places of opportunity. So potential places of resources such as, especially in New Mexico, uranium and gas, oil, Texas is full of, Arizona, they're just full of places of potential resource. But not only that, also people see them as places of pilgrimage to go and sort of find themselves. So the desert is there to serve. So there's all these conflicted concepts and mythologies around deserts. I've been so fortunate because I've been in these deserts through all the cycles. So through all the seasonal cycles of spring, summer, autumn, winter, or all the indigenous cycles of, they have Australian indigenous people often have 8 seasons rather than 4 seasons. And in New Mexico, the different traditional owners have different concepts of seasons to us. But there is that boom and bust. There is that we've been in a cycle in New Mexico of drought, and they're hoping that this year it's going to break. And they have monsoon rains in the deserts there. So you can have an afternoon where it just pours with rain and things pop up immediately. The plants and the animals can regenerate so quickly. So it's that wonderful cyclical nature of deserts. And that's why I think they have that sense for humans as being places of timelessness.
There is some wonderfully intense, vibrant blue in the work Bone Valley, which is not perhaps what, again, many people would tend to associate with deserts. But is that a reference to water as well?
There are these pockets in the desert of sort of rift creek valleys where some of the geology has opened up from below the surface. And so there are these little desert oases. And this is the same in India, it's the same in Africa, it's the same, I found them in Tunisia, I found them in Morocco. They're these incredible, I suppose the best way I can describe it is as a type of oasis where ancient forests still exist. Often they depend on those aquifers. And the more that we use those aquifers as a resource for farming in the desert and for mining in the desert and things like that, the aquifers are dropping. So the water's not staying in those places anymore. And these beautiful little microcosms and valleys of these ancient palms are dying. So I'm very conscious of the fact that time is kind of running out for a lot of areas of the desert that are really sacred or important to me.
Tell us the story behind the ancient forgiveness trees.
Desert trees grow very, very slowly. So they're not often very large, but when you do find one that's a significant size, they're very old. And there are a couple up behind my property, because I live right on the verge in New Mexico, right on the verge of big areas of national forest, they call it, but we'd call it, because it's not really forest, we'd call it national park. So I walk every day, every morning. I go for big hikes and walks through the national forest, and there's petroglyphs everywhere. And one day I was walking and I saw this little petroglyph on this carved rock between these big old trees, and it was a bird. And I was curious, and I've often the petroglyphs that you find in Central Australia and even in New Mexico too, but they're more abstract. This was a very figurative little bird, and I was so curious about it. And I did ask a Navajo friend of mine, and that I've walked out in the deserts a lot with, and she actually said to me, that's the bird, it's the messenger. And for the Navajo, the birds are the messengers. And there's a lot of ravens and crows and eagles, obviously, birds of prey, falcons, hawks, that fly through the deserts everywhere, Australia and New Mexico. But this is different. This little bird's different. It's nearly duck-like. And because there are a lot of these ephemeral rivers and the Rio Grande right there, I thought, oh, well, hunting ground. And obviously it's a message for the nomadic people that this is a good place for these birds. And so I was asking her, I was saying, oh, is it this, is it that, is it all my interpretations? And, tell me. And she just looked at me and she said, it's not my place to tell you. She said, you have to find out for yourself. And a lot of indigenous people they plant the seed, but they won't tell you the full story. And it's your job as an artist, or your job as someone of curiosity to find out what it means for you. And obviously my way of trying to understand what it means for me is to paint it. So I made that little painting.
There are some quite explicitly painted birds in the landscape in some of the works. For example, weather watcher cactus wren chasing cloud shadows, sandhills calling cranes, and a bird that sings within a dish of sand. How and why and when do you choose to so explicitly incorporate some of the bird life into the works?
When you're sitting very still out in a landscape, and I spend a lot of time, like days and weeks, just all day, just sitting out there painting. And, amazing things happen because you're peaceful and quiet and you're integrated into the natural world and the wilderness. It's a wilderness out there. And a bear or a coyote or an elk or a deer, an animal will just all of a sudden walk in front of you. And then they'll look at you and you look at them, and then it's like, okay, that's fine. And birds, there are birds everywhere in New Mexico because of the rivers, because there's a lot of water, because it's high mountain country. So a lot of the mountains have these weather systems, and there's a lot of permanent water there, rather than in Australia, the deserts don't have a lot of permanent waters, but there is permanent water in the desert in New Mexico. So there are a lot of animals and a lot of birds. Birds have come into the work as metaphors, not as literal kind of, a kookaburra or a hawk or an eagle, but they're really acting as metaphors for traversing that world of the seen and the unseen. Maybe it's something I'll keep doing. Maybe it's something I won't keep doing. But for this body of work, the birds just seem to be a presence that the landscape needed because they're there.
You made reference to O'Keeffe country at one stage, and that country that you're in the midst of is familiar perhaps to many through the works of Georgia O'Keeffe. Is there a little bit of a sense of a kind of O'Keeffe painting shadow over that environment? Does her work influence you in any way?
So we live right next door to, and she's just across the river, her house and her studio and everything. So I'm literally there. Georgia O'Keeffe is a huge presence in the American Southwest, and she has definitely been commercialised within an inch of, she's on every coffee mug, every tea towel, there's skulls hanging everywhere. So there is definitely a sense of it being sort of O'Keeffe country in a way, but like I said, it's once you're there, it goes well beyond that. You understand that that's such an insult to the indigenous people. New Mexico has the largest number of Native American reservations and pueblos in the whole of the United States. It's also got the biggest number of national parks and areas of wilderness. So she's such a tiny drop in the history of that place that it's to ignore the larger picture, to ignore the Native Americans. And I find it, like when you go out into the desert in Central Australia, to ignore the indigenous cultural heritage and history of that place is such an affront. It's such a disrespect that Georgia O'Keeffe doesn't really, she doesn't cast a shadow that intimidates me in any way. If anything, the indigenous history does that, because I'm constantly aware of country being a privilege to be able to work on other people's country and in sacred sites and being taken. They're just incredibly generous. I always find Indigenous people that I work with incredibly generous, allowing me to go to their traditional homelands and to work on country that they're custodians of, and they want you to. They want you to offer a different artistic version, and they never have a sense of if you show respect and if they know you're an artist, they encourage you to. I've been told so many times by Indigenous people, just do your job, just paint it, it's your job. So, and they want to see what you do with it. And often they think it's hysterical what I do because it's so different to what they do. And they enjoy it as much, as we enjoy having these conversations, because it's the reciprocal nature of art, which is lovely. You sort of learn from others and they trigger different responses in you and different ideas in you. So no, the O'Keeffe, I find her work fascinating and interesting, but totally different approach, and she's just one tiny element in the story of that place. It's a big story, has a big story.
Just going back to the practicalities of you working and responding to that landscape, how do you work? How much is plein air and how much is created in the studio?
All the work comes from working plein air. So my work is fieldwork. I just love working directly in the landscape. But I do have this fabulous studio. It's tiny, but it's fabulous because it's right there in the middle of the desert. But dealing with the elements when you're in the desert is always something you have to cope with when you work on plein air. But I always work with my studies out on plein air first. And I try and work to a degree on plein air every day. And then I can spend all night in the studio if I want. I can spend all day, all afternoon in the studio. And that's so lovely because I have all these big windows down one side and I just look out and I see up the whole valley. So I can still be working on plein air, but in the studio. The studio is on plein air. So I never have that disconnect. And I think that's what's made a difference to the painting. The fact that I'm just there in the desert painting all the time, whether I'm in a shelter or whether I'm, sitting somewhere.
Well, it's been wonderful to be able to share your response to that extraordinary environment around you. So, Jo Bertini, thanks very much for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for your interest.